Next up is the Future of Digital Policy in Europe panel. I'll be joined by 3 panelists soon. The panelists here? Oh, here they are. All right, give a big hand for Katarzyna, Guillermo, and Prabhat. There they are. Do you guys need help? Okay. Hey. All right, so a little bit of introductions. I'll start ladies first. Katarzyna Szymielewicz, co-founder and president of the Panoptykon Foundation, lawyer and activist specializing in human rights and technology. And you might have recognized her from the talk she was part of yesterday, and Kasha for short, right? Okay, that's cool. Prabhat Agarwal. Prabhat's been with the European Commission for the last 12 years, now doing online platforms and e-commerce. He's a policymaker at the EU Commission dealing with regulating platforms. And you have a tech background. You studied physics, computer science, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a long resume. And then we have Guillermo Beltrà. Guillermo is a global policy director at Access Now, a global NGO working to defend human rights for users at risk. So thank you for joining me today. I want to talk about digital policy in Europe, but just to kind of level set and start, GDPR went into effect about a year and a half ago. What do you think we've learned since? Which parts are working and which parts are not working? Anyone can start. Yeah, Prabhat, you wanted to?
So I think, I don't want to go into the details of kind of which part, because it's a huge piece of law. And let me just zoom out on kind of a couple of things, what work and what don't work. You know, of course, I get annoyed, like many people, clicking away my cookie consent forms. But I think that kind of distracts from the real issue. I think that what's really impressive is that I think GDPR has really been a game changer in kind of how we see tech policy and tech regulation, you know, taking an issue which is a fundamental rights issue, you know, and putting a frame around it. And what I think has been really surprising is that I've been kind of part of this from the beginning, but from a slight distance, because this is a data protection issue dealt with by another team. But the way that we've turned 180 degrees from something that was completely crazy, completely impossible, it would never work, it would destroy the internet, to something where a lot of people say, wow, you know, this is like a really powerful framework for protecting user rights, and you know, lots of people are saying we want to now copy this, at least in part, you know, around the world, and I think that's been really a learning experience that has informed some of my thinking. Okay, so you know, some of the things that are still kind of settling in right now, you know, because it's relatively recent, so it's a lot of emphasis now is shifting away from the actual meaning of the rules and how they apply now to enforcing those. You know, like, so we see cases being geared up by data protection authorities in member states. We see the global conversation around data protection and privacy changing. So those are really the game-changing positive elements. I think some of the negative elements that I think people are annoyed about is the kind of banner clicking. But let's not forget that there is also e-privacy regulation that is still being negotiated, and I'm still hoping that it'll be adopted soon. That will at least in part solve some of the issues, you know. But in general, people are much more aware of privacy issues around the internet than just even a couple of years ago. People are taking it much more seriously. It's conversation in schools, it's conversation not only in some offices in Brussels, but it's conversations worldwide. I think that's really my takeaway from what has happened.
Nice.
Yeah. No, I think I agree. Politically, it's a success in the sense that it has sparked this global conversation about the importance of privacy and data protection. We've seen a 10% increase in countries that have actually adopted new data protection frameworks that are completed. And there's like 30 other countries around the world that are now working on their new data protection frameworks. So I was thinking, so I agree the main objective of the GDPR is to put some legal structure on the protection of a fundamental right in Europe. And it's important to remember that it's everything that's in GDPR is not new. Actually, not many things are new. It's just bringing an old data protection law into kind of more the modern area and putting some obligations and some enforcement measures on top of it. But I was thinking earlier in the panel you guys had on governing AI about how do you regulate a market? Like, how do you tell the market where a market, in that case it was AI, but here it's like more the digital space, where do you want it to go? And that, I think, is that the GDPR is a good public policy tool, because in addition to protecting a fundamental right, you're telling the market, that's the direction I want you guys to innovate towards and to think towards. And in that sense, it is being a success. All that said, like Prabhat just said, it's way too soon. It only entered into force about a year and a half ago. There's still Slovenia and Greece have not developed their own implementing laws nationally. Data protection authorities are way far from having sufficient resources to go police everything that they have to go police. So we're happy where things are going, but there's a lot of work to be done still.
Yeah, did you want to weigh in as well?
I fully agree. It's a bit too early. I think we need at least 3 more years to see the enforcement measures at full speed. What was the biggest victory in GDPR is that the old rules existing for 2 decades, got extended globally because they finally are used successfully against global companies who target European citizens with their services, and that wasn't the case before. And B, we have money is in place. Huge financial fines are in place, and that's the conversation starter or a door opener for the EU to start negotiating the standards really. But where it gets difficult is this moment where we realize that GDPR is proposing very sound rules for old business models that are in fundamental conflict with these rules. So if you think about cookies or pop-ups, I mean, we cannot imagine the amount of pop-ups necessary to fulfill the need to inform people about what's going on with their data behind the screen. That's not the solution. We have to remove the data. We have to end the data transfers happening behind the screen rather than try to clean them or legalize them with pop-ups or any measures of that sort. And this is where it gets difficult, because at some point, enforcement of GDPR will have to mean that we cancel some of the business models. We simply delegalize them, like the whole ad tech business model. The advertising technology developed in a way that cannot be reconciled with GDPR. No pop-up will clean it. So we have to face it. And that's the difficult part, because even for data protection authorities today, it is a bit hard to say, okay, that branch of the industry has to disappear because it's not in line with our principles. That's the hard bit.
Yeah, I'm glad you and Prabhat brought up the cookie pop. This is a hot button issue backstage when we were talking about, when you go to a website, it says, hey, we are asking to save cookies on your computer. Is that okay? I feel like I get that pop-up still 50 times a day. But Guillermo, when I mentioned that, you said, don't blame the sites for that pop-up. Like, who's at blame for that annoyance? Or is that even a bad thing?
Or the law. Like, what's important to recognize is that nobody's forcing those advertising networks to do those complex cookie pop-ups or consent notices via email that way at all. And to Kasia's point, nobody's forcing them to have that business model where it's all based on tracking every single one of us, every single click we do around the web. So the whole point is, how do we nudge the market out of that business model, fully agreed, into one that is much more privacy friendly, but also remember that the GDPR is not the only legislative tool that Europe has in the equation. Prabhat has just mentioned the e-privacy regulation. This goes hand in hand with the GDPR, and it's not complete yet. And it's there where the EU is trying to give some rules out there to users and to market actors about how to deal with, for example, browser settings and kind of the settings on the devices on what companies can and cannot do with our own personal data and with our devices. And unfortunately, that legislative file is stuck.
Did you want to?
Yeah, just maybe just a side comment. I think that, one thing is kind of to focus on the kind of friction and the annoyance, and the other thing is to kind of turn it around a little bit and say that actually, that bit of friction is making apparent, it's surfacing something that has been kind of been hiding, and so, it feels a little bit like kind of, there's a kind of bump under the carpet, and before you couldn't really feel the bump, right? And now you kind of say, hey, there's a funny bump under the carpet. What's going on? And you kind of look under the carpet, and you see all these this whole tracking business that's going on, right? And so of course the bump is uncomfortable, and it'd be much nicer if the bump went there, but actually it's worth looking under the carpet and to see what's going on there, and I think that so we would, we have regulated and made proposals for making the bump a bit more smoother. It's just what Guillermo said, and let's see what the future of that file holds. But I think besides ironing out the bump, let's take a look under the carpet, and let's have a look at what's actually going on there, and that's something that we'll be focusing on in the next couple of months and years to come, to take to shine a light a little bit on exactly a very complex kind of industry and a kind of complex service, which is, I think it's. I'm not really, I'm agnostic at this particular point whether it's something that, like Kasia said, we need to kind of be tough on that. But, I'm also conscious that actually some of this is cross-financing free services, and there's a huge expectation of consumers to kind of consume content for free on the web. So our first step is going to be just to take a look, like and take a look with an open mind at a very complex area. What we do know, though, from some behavioral research that we've been doing and commissioning, is that when you talk to users, the first time you talk to users and you say, hey, what do you think about targeting? What do you think about recommender systems and so on? The first time they say, hey, this is really good stuff, like I get what I want, And then you iterate and you explain, hey, do you know how they get to know how to target you? And I said, I didn't know. And then the second iteration, they said, maybe it's not such a great idea. If you iterate once more, people can swing their views on whether they like what's going on quite a lot. And I think that process of discussion is really something that we need to have now again, rather than being stuck on just the annoying banners that we see, which I find annoying too.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to add on top of that?
Yeah, just maybe that the bottom line in the existing system is that people are, on one hand, observed constantly beyond their awareness. On the other, they are constantly targeted. So that's a deeply unfair setting in which our users operate. And we cannot fix this system by adding more trust or more transparency or another pop-up. It's just unfixable that way. We have to rebuild it. And that's why I'm saying that some business models will have to go away, because they're fundamentally, they cannot be aligned with the principles of trust, transparency, choice that we built in the European law. It's like with ecology, we can discuss how to deal with waste and how to recycle, but wouldn't it be better to produce less waste? Or remove from the waste culture which we are embedded in? That's exactly the same challenge we face in the digital ecosystem.
Yeah.
Just two quick thoughts, actually, on all of this. One is, first of all, it's very encouraging to hear that an important regulator, like the European Commission, is now willing to lift up the carpet and look underneath it, because many groups like ours, we've been kind of sounding
Waving
that
the
alarm
carpet.
bell for 10, 15 years.
I'm liking this carpet metaphor. This is great.
There was an ongoing global conversation about this whole do not track standard, and when that failed, we, at least in Europe, were saying, well, then we got to find at least a European solution, because online tracking cannot become just the main business model everywhere, and it has, and it's bigger and bigger. So how to keep that under control? So it's great that the European Commission now has that approach, but also the GDPR has important principles. So I'm coming back to the question on enforcement as well. We have a lot of rules, but not a lot of resources and time yet to actually go enforce them. So for example, privacy by design and by default are two very important principles that I bet you anything all these ad networks are not complying with if it came to a court to have to rule on that. So there are already tools that we have to start using to iron out that carpet and get all those business models that are not compatible with fundamental rights out the door.
Yeah, this may be wrong, but sometimes it feels like the EU is more concerned with lifting up that carpet than the US government. Is that true, or is that not accurate? Kasia, do you want to take that one?
I mean, I take European perspective. I'm looking at what FTC does and what what US-based politicians like Elizabeth Warren say from European perspective. So I actually see quite radical headlines coming from the US. I also remember, I think 2 years ago, US-based researchers and advocates coming to CPDP, our annual Brussels-based conference on privacy, with this "Break Them Up" banner. And I thought, like, wow, welcome, guys. Like, finally somebody's saying this really forceful way, really open. So from my perspective, US-based entities and public entities like FTC are actually using forceful measures like financial fines for quite a while against these companies, and I believe they already got to the wall, to the point where they see that structural measures like breaking them up are necessary because financial fines clearly don't work. So maybe they haven't came up with privacy protective regulation yet. It's only now happening. But before us, they started using pro-competition measures against these big platforms because they had them at home. And maybe they were the first to see targeting risks or manipulation of public debate risks because they had a lot of this business going on before we saw it at full scale in Europe with, say, Brexit campaign. So I wouldn't be that critical. I think a lot of interesting ideas are coming from the other side of the Atlantic as well.
What do you guys think? Do you feel like GDPR loosened the jar and then the US is kind of like, oh yeah, us too? Like, do you think?
Yeah, I think that, so first of all, this is what I meant earlier, you know, the conversation, the global conversation around regulating tech has of course changed. You know, that's part of it is like a general techlash kind of phenomenon. And the other one is that, you know, people are looking all over the world about, you know, kind of similar issues, you know, whether it's data protection or content moderation, or you know, like what happened after the Christchurch incident was a kind of example where kind of governments are saying, hey, what are you going to do about it? Kind of just watch this happening. I just want a warning, and maybe that's a bit weird from the European Commission to say that, but you know, the quantity of regulation is not necessarily a good indicator, you know, of success. You know, it's you know, we see the Russian internet law is about to come in force on the 1st of November. You know, and we really have quite serious concerns about that. You know, so it's not just whether you are regulating the net and how many laws you've got there. You know, it's really about finding you know, a good operable framework that gives market participants clarity, that protects fundamental rights and users' rights, you know, and that meets kind of legitimate, well-specified policy aims, and that's really kind of what we should be looking at, you know, not really the amount of regulation. There's no shortage of appetite, particularly in less free countries, to regulate the internet, you know. So let's not forget that, you know, like this should not be the only yardstick that we that we apply. You know, whether what the yardstick we should be applying is, are we solving a real problem? Do we have evidence of the nature, the scale, and the depth of the problem? Are we taking the least invasive option, which is still effective? You know, to address these problems. This is the standard to which the Commission should hold itself, and we do. And then the democratic process should challenge that, right? And but it's really important not to just say, is there enough regulation or not? Because that puts us in a binary of whether we regulate or not. That's the wrong framing. The wrong framing is what's the problem exactly, and how we're going to solve it.
Got it. And Guillermo?
Yeah, and well, first of all, also to say, like I agree, just regulation for the sake of regulation is not what we're talking about. And if I may, Europe doesn't do everything right either. So we're not, like as a civil society, I think we're not happy with every internet-related regulation that has come out of the EU. Look at the copyright directive or what might happen with the terrorist content directive, so on. But for me, the point is that there are many conversations around the world, in Latin America, in the US, in India, in so many different fora as well, about how do we deal with these complex multidimensional internet problems, and the solution will not always be through EU-style regulation. And that may be fine, as long as we are solving problems as long as we're finding solutions to the societal problems. One important precision I think that is always important to remember is that the GDPR is not just, now that we're zooming into the GDPR, it's not just a protective sphere for Europeans or for people in Europe. It's actually, if you read the title of the GDPR, the second part of it is, and to enable data flows around the world or something like this, or cross-border data flows. The GDPR is designed as a tool to actually make the internet work in a private, like in a data protection respective way. And that's something that we need the European Commission as well to, through those negotiations it has with other countries so that the personal data can flow in both directions, uphold, kind of help elevate the level of data protection around the world.
Yeah, I want to go, that's a really good point, but I want to go back to what Prabhat was saying about, what I got from that was essentially quantity is not important, like the quality of the laws being passed is more important. And this is a question I asked in the previous panel, but whenever I see Facebook and Google being fined billions and looking at how much they make just in a quarter, which is multiple billions, like if we're talking about future of policy for these internet companies, how do you go about reprimanding or putting in effective laws when money is no object? How do you do that?
Well, it's a good question. So the treaty says that sanctions should be dissuasive, proportionate, and effective. You know, and yeah, and we're asking ourselves, what does that mean now? You know, if the stock price goes up after you hit a company with a $5 billion dollar fine, you know, is that dissuasive? You know, is that effective? And is it proportionate? You know, so. That's a really good question. You know, like ultimately though, the fine is a means to an end. The end is the behavior change. You know, that and the compliance to the rules. You know, like so it's certainly something we're going to take into account. And you know, the Commission on Antitrust has fined Google on numerous occasions. You know, like in some cases. You know, there have been commitments which we're monitoring and to see whether they're really living up. So it's not just about the fine. So there's also a follow-up on that. But you're right. I mean, I think we are entering into a space where we're asking ourselves, you know, what does dissuasive really look like? You know, and that's a really important question. You know, and a lot of people are asking that question in terms of kind of, and they're framing it. I'm not necessarily framing it like this, but it is being framed as a matter of sovereignty, rule of law, kind of, you know, who's the boss here? You know, like it's not necessarily how I view it, but this is this is part of the conversation out there, you know, and so I don't have a good answer of what the alternative is, but it's certainly something we're going to look at.
I have a suggestion. I think there are at least 3 approaches, and 2 of them we already tried. First is taxing them, because that's effectively what the fines are. It's just another tax imposed on these companies, and they're clearly ready to pay that tax because they became wealthy enough to do it, and that's not going to be effective. But, well, I mean, transferring money from their budgets to public budgets makes sense. I'm not saying stop fining them. Yes, please continue, but remember that there are 2 other approaches possible. Second is what I call constitution for digital emperors. We can approach these digital emperors and kindly ask them to be more protective of our principles, our rights. So ask Facebook to observe due process when it's removing content, or maybe reveal more information about targeting, political ads, all other types of content. You know, we've been discussing this for a decade, I believe. We had some progress. GDPR also can be seen as this constitution for the emperor to some extent. I believe Digital Services Act, another initiative coming from Brussels, which I welcome very much, could be such a constitution. But that's still not taking the power away from these emperors, and that will be the third approach, which is structural measures, but not case by case, having FTC or European Commission busy investigating, you know, multiple markets, different companies, but maybe having some new data ecosystem in mind, projecting this ecosystem and designing it with regulatory measures. That's a really interesting approach that I advocate for, also in my previous talk in this space, and I think that's the biggest challenge. Of course, we know we won't come up with it next month, but maybe next 5 years is the time frame in which we could redevelop our thinking about this data ecosystem and propose simply new structure, move the power a bit around the field.
Yeah, that emperor-empire metaphor is so strong. I want to go back to, go ahead.
Can I just add, learning from past mistakes is also very important. So a very recent one is allowing the merger between Facebook and WhatsApp. I think that it's now evident that we've just allowed that giant to become so big that it has created that it now controls effectively the largest communication platform in the world, and regulating it and keeping under control all the problems that stem from that has become so complex because of that. And in hindsight, at least from a European context, the European Commission was in a good place to say, wait a second, this is probably going to create way more problems than benefits. The question is whether competition rules and the policies that that help the Commission make those decisions are up and kind of ready for the digital age. And that's another question that we need to be asking. How can we rethink all those frameworks and all those enforcer authorities to be able to deal with such new complex phenomena?
Yeah. Yeah, we don't, well, so the panelists told me that they want to forfeit some of their time to hear some of your questions. So I'll only keep it at 2 more questions, and then you guys can hear from them, the audience. But going back to what you said before about how GDPR, a big part of it is like data flow freely around the world, and global is the first word in GDPR. I want to talk to you about global, not just regional, but also being all-inclusive. Like, it's only lawmakers generally who kind of have a influence over the laws that get passed. Guillermo, how do we bring in everyone or other folks to kind of affect these laws?
So that's an interesting conversation we were having backstage as well. In the context of, first of all, and we had a very interesting conversation about what is our understanding of the open internet globally? Like, what does open mean? And there is such a multiple fora, both regulatory and self-regulatory, and just conversations around the world, that it's not very easy to just pinpoint one place where you can say, okay, there is where you really need a kind of a multi-stakeholder approach, because on some you have it, on some you don't. So right now, just the complexity of the global conversation about all these issues is pretty unmanageable. What we were talking about just earlier is that when you have conversations about, for example, how do we regulate issues like freedom of expression online, and what is good regulation to protect that fundamental, that human right, for us it is very important, and that's a lot of what we do globally, to bring in groups that are the most affected to the conversation, the most marginalized and vulnerable groups that see themselves most affected when there is content about issues that they care of being taken down, or when they are suffering a lot of just online attacks to who they are or to what they're doing and so on. And having those voices in those conversations is just key at any level.
Yeah. And then last question I want to ask everybody on stage before I open up to the audience is just like, what does a win look like? Like, what should we aim for here? And don't all rush at once.
It's a hard one, right? I don't think we can have final answer today because that's a process. That's something that I believe should be the task for the whole movement of people in MozFest and beyond MozFest, because it is a real task that we have to, work on together. Nobody should have the arrogance to say that's the win for everybody. But definitely what's not the win is the current situation when we have big dominant players in the middle of the ecosystem controlling data flows, controlling what is allowed, what is not allowed, guessing the needs of all these vulnerable people, ruling them basically in quite authoritarian way. That's what we want to depart from. So on the other side of that spectrum, I can see open ecosystem in which, for example, vulnerable groups can organize themselves bottom up and define what it means for them to be safe or what it means for them to express themselves, and then the ecosystem basically including this, allowing for that diversity. So a diverse, federated, open ecosystem, which is not ruled by any benevolent emperor, but basically much more bottom-up and preserved with rules like GDPR, like hopefully new regulations providing for privacy and security.
How about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could have said it better. That's the whole concept. We have to protect the internet as the public resource that it is to enable communities, individuals, and also companies to thrive in a way in which it empowers and expands fundamental rights and innovation and so on, and not the contrary. And we've been having this, I've been like in multiple circles having similar conversations throughout these past days, and I've heard some ask, are we having a nostalgic vision of the internet? Is it that what it used to be and we just have to change mindset? I would say no. That's still, that for me is still the idea. It's just the dynamics might be different. The technology is definitely different. Now, things like, for example, the advent of AI and so on complicate the whole conversation even much more and so on. But the idea of having this public resource that helps society work better and integrate better amongst themselves and be more open, is definitely what we should strive for.
Prabhat?
I think, from my perspective, I think there are kind of three elements of a win. You know, one is that users feel kind of safe and empowered online, but also free. You know, and where that balance lies is going to be our challenge in the next kind of couple of months. But I think that on those two aspects, you know, users being safe, empowered, and free, I think the balance isn't quite right at the moment. You know, it's part of the abuse problem that we mentioned. It's maybe the ad tracking problem that Kasia mentioned. You know, that's one thing. There's a third element which we didn't really discuss, which from the EU perspective is super important, is that to continue to make sure that the EU is a great place to start kind of innovative service. You know, and just maybe I'll end on this anecdote. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Riga. And there's a great startup, students setting up a kind of house sharing platform when they move into university. You know, it's great stuff, and they wanted to expand to Amsterdam and Berlin, and the guys just looked at me. Are there any EU laws that I should be aware of? You know, and I just said no, don't worry. You know, but so it was. But you know, it needs to be. We need to make sure that we also keep these people in mind. We focus on Facebook and Google and the big ones. You know, but there are like 10,000 small startups in Europe. You know, all trying to kind of grow here at home. You know, and they need to make sure. We need to also make rules that work for these people, you know. So a win for me is a situation in which users are safe, empowered, and free online, and where small startups feel that Europe is a good place to start a business. You know.
I just want to add one more on
Sure.
the big ones. A win for me would also be if the knowledge generated about humankind, all of us, by the big ones, can serve the smaller ones and can serve the public purpose. Let's not forget that there is also a lot of knowledge or value generated by the existing ecosystem, the closed existing ecosystem, that is now controlled for commercial reasons, but we don't want to destroy it, right? We want to, I hope, reuse it for a better. So that's also a target.
Nice. All right, now audience question and answer. Anybody have any questions? I've got a few in the middle, one in the back. Kevin's coming around with a microphone right now.
Hi, thanks for the panel. It was really interesting. I just wanted to pick up on the point about competition law, which I think Guillermo mentioned, and how does that need to evolve in the EU and beyond? Because consumers are giving their data away for free. They're not exchanging money with these companies. So how do you measure detriment when it's not someone losing money and there might not be a choice to switch to a different service provider?
Should I take this?
Sure, you can take it.
So that's a really good question. So in my team and in also a DG competition of the European Commission, like the antitrust team, we are in an ongoing conversation about exactly that, what you've just said. And I think you might have seen that there are a couple of reports that have been, you know, just have been published this year around the future of competition law and in this space. And I think that what we're doing right now, and it's going to take a little bit of time, but digesting all the recommendations that have been made at EU level, in Germany, in the UK, in the US, also in Australia, and we're kind of processing this at the moment to distill which elements of recommendations will go through a kind of review of competition rules and to what extent are they necessary. But we're also looking at, in this area, if there's any need for additional ex-ante regulations, you know, to help that. But the point that you're making, that the kind of consumer standard, consumer welfare standard, is something to kind of double check, is that really the right standard? That's certainly something we're looking at very closely. So we have a pretty good team of people looking at it. It's the same team that was responsible for the antitrust enforcement for Google. And I think there's a willingness to kind of take a fresh look at this. And Executive Vice President Vestager has also announced that we would be looking at that and as a follow-up. How exactly it would look like, I think there are some ideas in the table. We're just kind of going through exactly what has been proposed. And it's not going to be a quick win, but it's certainly something we're taking very seriously. So point fully taken, and there's at least 2 full working teams on this to follow it up in the Commission.
Great. Any other questions out in the audience? We had a couple over here. Actually, there's a few. Is
Yeah,
Kevin still
thanks.
going to have
I'm Jesse McCroskey, a data scientist with Mozilla, and thanks for the thoughtful discussion. I was curious that given that many problematic uses of data online, you use the example of the ad tech industry, which I think is great, can really constitute human experimentation. Do you think that the existing frameworks around ethical approval for human experimentation could be a useful tool here?
I believe you refer to framework for research, right? Yeah, that's a brilliant idea, and I think also coming back recurrently in terms of Horizon 2020 and these types of publicly funded programs that absolutely should include this thinking. I mean, I'm saying as an external observer, I'm either a researcher here nor a regulator. I wonder what Prabhat has to say, but yeah, definitely it's something that funders of public research should have in mind. I don't know if they do.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, but I think that your question was probably not so much about publicly funded research that's going on, but actually about the tech industry practice itself, whether that should be subject to prior authorization due to kind of in the same way that biotech experiments by private companies have to be pre-approved. Is that what you wanted to? Yeah, I think so. We're not there yet, but it's definitely an interesting avenue of thought for publicly funded research. Even if it's carried out by private companies, there is an ethical screening, and data protection aspects are a mandatory part of that screening. So if you want to get R&D money from the European Commission, even as a company as Facebook or some other company, and that involves data protection relevant issues, you have to do a screening, otherwise you don't get the money. But whether the industry itself should be subject to such screening is a good question. I don't have a good answer, but it's something that's worth examining.
Anyone else want to? Okay, next question. Let's see where Kevin has the microphone. Right over there.
Hi. I was wondering, Kasia said that this new ecosystem, part of it should come bottom up. So I was wondering, as citizens, what can we do to try and help push things in the right direction? Should we be weaning ourselves off Google and Facebook and all these things?
In the ecosystem, I imagine I do not assume movement of people outside of these networks. I think that could be a consequence of a new version, a federated version. So once you have a federated one, then there are places where we can move. But before we create it, it's rather forcing these companies to open their APIs to the level where we can experiment and add new layers, new alternative services on them, to start with something. Like, for example, there is a lot of discussion around newsfeed, how messy, how uncomfortable, how, thank you for the human experimentation line of thinking, I will use it, how evil the newsfeed, for example, is for how it's not to my benefit, right? It's there to stimulate me and manipulate me, not to help me. I want a different one. Can I achieve it? Well, technically, yes, right? I can imagine an API that allows an external developer to propose a better, safer algorithm to function on Facebook. So the ecosystem, I imagine, has this possibility, and then eventually we might imagine this as a federated structure where, yes, people could also move somewhere else. But right now they have nowhere to move, and we have to acknowledge this.
I think what the point you raise, I have a slightly different perspective, but I don't want to contradict Kasia because she's got great ideas. But I think that the power of users to take their business elsewhere is really enormous, and you shouldn't underestimate that. It's a really powerful factor in changing companies' behavior. Much more I think than regulators think. And we know this from documents about strategy documents about how to counter WeChat or how to counter Snapchat and so on. This is a really important thing. So conscious consuming, is really a hugely important factor. And you do have choice, an agency. And one of the things that we want to also say is that you're not. Sometimes what I get a little bit frustrated with in conversations in Brussels, in my bubble, is that users are represented as kind of purely passive, that they are just kind of victims of what is thrown at them, and they have zero agencies. And I think maybe we're simultaneously over and underestimating the agency of the users. You know, like sometimes in some aspects we think that they can do more than they can reasonably do in an attention economy. But in other cases, I think consumers do have a choice. You know, and they can make a conscious a choice when you pick your food and when you pick your clothes. You know, you take conscious choices. You know, you can also do some of that online. And educate yourself, and this is something that is really something as part of the conversation. It's not only about regulation, it's also about empowering people and educating users, you know, and I'm actually very optimistic. I see it when we work, in the little bit of work we do with kids, and we should be doing much more, is that we actually are aware of a much higher level of awareness than we sometimes assume about the dangers and so on, and their usage patterns are different from what the kind of, you know, Lambda user in the policymaker's head is. And that's an important part. So maybe I'm overemphasizing, I'm over-optimistic, but I do think this is an important part of the conversation.
I would emphasize Prabhat's last point about read about this, like talk to your friends about these issues, get more interested, look into how these platforms are designed to capture your attention and keep you there. Because I, for one, deleted my Facebook account a year and a half ago, haven't missed it for a day. We might, there might be some examples where we don't really have alternatives, and you'll ask yourself, yeah, but then where do I go? But ask yourself also, do I really need it? Could I be spending my time somewhere else on the internet that is more creative for me, more participatory, more, and yeah, just don't, let's have this conversation be more mainstream than it actually is.
Just to clarify my point, that nowhere to go does not refer to lack of other brands or services. I mean the business model. If the business model everywhere is more or less the same, we really have nowhere to go. So that's what I mean, and that's why I think we need to rethink ecosystem so it becomes not service-driven but value-driven.
Yeah. I think we have time for... That's all the time we have? Okay, well, that's all the time we have for this panel. But
it's late. Let's take one more.
Yeah, we'll do one more. We'll do one more. Hand up back there. Yeah, that's a good call.
My question for the panel is, should EU policy support the concept of digital generativity? And by that, I mean the idea that if you do things like interoperability and decentralization, you can enable uncoordinated audiences to collaborate and generate unplanned innovation. The classic example is the Payment Services Directive 2, whereby mandating open APIs for banking and also allowing users to take their data, that at least in theory allows new third parties to come up with new services and makes the EU much more competitive compared to the US, where banking's in the Stone Age. Sorry, friend.
I'm all for it.
Yeah, simple answer, yes, absolutely. And it's great that you raised the PSD too, because that's one example. But there's another example. For example, in EU telecoms law now, there is the power for regulatory authorities to force interoperability between chat apps, between, say, WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram and so on. Is that something that they're going to be using or not? But definitely having that as a policy goal to help create that interop and that decentralization, we're all in favor, for sure.
No.
Yeah, I mean, so and we're pretty proud of those the innovations in the interoperability space that you both mentioned, and I think that's something that we want to build on. I just have a small word of caution in there, is that interoperability really works well when you have kind of two equivalent things that you can really connect to each other. You know, like and in the banking system or in net neutrality regulations, you know, you deal with. You deal with things that you can easily interconnect because they're basically the same. You know, it's not super trivial to take that concept and to take it to kind of very heterogeneous systems. You know, like Mastodon and Facebook are kind of very different things. You know, like and so while the principle of interoperability and decentralized kind of thing is really good, how to make it work in practice, I think this is something that requires a little bit more conversation. I think there's an interesting standard which was proposed a couple of years ago by W3C about social media, you know, news feeds and so on. You know, that was designed to enable this kind of decentralized federation. And I think we're going to take a fresh look at that and have a you know, to have a better understanding of what was you know, what happened to that and so on. So yes, in principle, slight word of caution on how would this work in practice. You know.
One of the takeaways from discussions here in this space was let's take step-by-step approach. Maybe start with the lower-hanging fruit, like federating the public posts without discussing private groups or private messages that are more difficult. So also that could be like the banking directive. It doesn't really open the whole ecosystem. It opens just one layer, but that's already a big breakthrough, right? So we could take the similar approach here.
All right, I think that's all the time we have. So big round of applause for our panelists today on stage right now and all day today. That is our show. This is the end of Mozilla MozFest 2019. I'm Xavier Harding, and see you guys soon.
See you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.